Good morning. It's Monday, May 12th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 584 days old. Hope everyone had a nice Mother's Day weekend. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. A huge weekend of news. So huge, it's truly hard to know where to start. Maybe we'll just start with Stephen Witkoff, the president's envoy to many, many things. He appeared to take a swipe at Israel yesterday, blaming the government for perpetuating the war rather than making a deal that would return all the hostages and end the conflict, as if the war was only being fought because of the hostages. It's, of course, disappointing to see the U.S. and Israel not on the same page, but I must say I am heartened by the expected return of American-Israeli Idan Alexander today. He's been held hostage thanks to pressure put on Hamas and its patron in Qatar by the Trump administration. Well, there were clear nuclear talks over the weekend, so today's guest is Andrew Ghalili, a senior policy analyst at the National Union for Democracy in Iran, or NUFDI. FDD and NUFDI go back a ways, both tracking maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic and maximum support for the Iranian people. Andrew's going to join us to break down yesterday's nuclear talks in Oman and to give us his take on what might be coming down the pike. So stick around for that chat coming up in just a few. The government of Qatar is eager to please Donald Trump. That much is clear. The corrupt and terror-supporting regime announced that it would be gifting a $400 million plane to the United States. The move is reportedly born of Trump's frustration with Boeing and its inability to quickly produce a plane that could replace the aging Air Force One. The controversy could have ended there. It could have simply been a question of whether the United States should accept an airplane from a corrupt Islamist Middle East regime that sponsors Hamas, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and worse. But it gets more interesting because the Qataris want to donate the plane after Trump's term in office to the Trump Presidential Library. I'm not entirely sure what this means yet, but if you go to the Reagan Library, as I did many years ago, you can actually walk right on to the Gippers Air Force One. It's a very cool thing to do. But is that what President Trump has in mind? A plane that is parked right in the middle of his library? Or does he want to keep using the Qatari plane? I don't think we know that yet. But the president's critics are predictably howling with disapproval. Interestingly, it's not just his critics. If you want to see some tough reactions from one of the president's biggest supporters, check out the X feed of Laura Loomer. When it comes to her disdain for Qatar, she pulls no punches, and I, for one, appreciate that. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the IDF is closing in on victory in the Hamas stronghold of Rafah in southern Gaza, with heavy fighting now focused on the neighborhood of Janina. If you've been watching, you know that Rafah has long been a flashpoint in this war. The town buttressing the border with Egypt was the subject of all eyes on Rafah memes and diplomatic debates last year. It was the place the Biden administration urged Israel, in fact, warned Israel to avoid entering. That was last spring during Ramadan, and it's where the bodies of those 6 hostages, including American citizen Hersh Goldberg Poland, were uncovered by Israeli forces just hours after they were murdered by their captives. Well, it's all eyes on Rafah again. This time, Israel's Golani Brigade has spent the past few days dismantling terror infrastructure, uncovering tunnel shafts, and eliminating dozens of terrorists in Janina from Hamas's rapidly unraveling Rafah Brigade. From what I understand, if the IDF is successful here, it could be a real turning point, and at a moment where Israel has come under fire, including from Stephen Witkoff, for lengthening the duration of the conflict. Headline 2, after 43 years, Israel brought home the body of a fallen soldier, Sergeant First Class Zvi Feldman, from deep inside Syria. It took decades of work and a daring operation, the high-risk recovery mission, spearheaded largely by non-Israeli Mossad agents. That's kind of a strange term. Working for the Mossad, that marked the culmination of decades of covert research, fieldwork, genomic analysis, and deep cover intelligence. It's quite a story. Feldman vanished alongside fellow tank crewmen Sergeant First Class Yehuda Katz and Sergeant First Class Zachary Balmel in a battle that claimed 21 Israeli lives during the Second Lebanon War. The Syrians played a significant role in that war, supporting groups like Hezbollah. Those are the guys that did most of the fighting. Baumel's remains were brought home in 2019. Now with Feldman identified and returned to rest, only Katz is unaccounted for. And headline 3, the IDF almost attacked Yemen yesterday. Almost doesn't count unless you're talking about a game of horseshoes or if you're throwing hand grenades. In other words, it looks like the Israelis didn't strike, but they did issue warnings for Yemenis to vacate 3 different seaports, and then media began reporting that strikes were underway. I echoed those reports, and I was wrong because it was fake news, and the entire episode was rather odd. I'm not sure what Israel hoped to achieve here, but if you ask me, it looks like the Houthis were even more emboldened after the false alarm. How do I know this? Because over the past few days, some of the Houthi X accounts that I follow have started jawing at me, both publicly and in direct messages. One of the accounts that I follow claims that the Houthis have a hypersonic missile that can reach Israel in 11 minutes. I'm not buying that yet, but I do think we can all admit that the Houthis still have a lot of missiles that they are eager to fire. There are other headlines that we're tracking this morning, like the reported deal between Turkey and the PKK that would end the Kurdish terror group's campaign of violence. We'll see how that one shapes up for a headline or maybe even an interview in the next episode. And of course, we're watching for the release of Idan Alexander, bated breath. Here's hoping he's released with no complications. All right, it's time to jump into that conversation with Andrew Ghalili of NUFDI. When it comes to unpacking round 4 of those nuclear talks, Andrew's got us covered, so let's dive in. Welcome to the program, Andrew Ghalili.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's talk about these talks. Maybe before we even get into what happened, what were the positions of the parties going into round 4?
Sure. So big picture, let's start with the key stakeholders. Ultimately, President Trump, going into this, his goal has long been use maximum pressure campaign to bring the regime to the table and get a strong nuclear deal. His goal is no nuclear Iran. That's what he had stated for months. Now, it's debatable if that means no nuclear Iran under his watch for 4 years, if that means as part of a legacy, no nuclear Iran ever. His being his accomplishment, up for debate. I tend to think he very clearly meant no nuclear Iran ever. Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. That has been clarified by President Trump and others in his administration. As recently as May 4th, I think it was, he said complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program is all I would accept. Now, he added a clarification there that there's been rumors or people have floated the idea of Iran maintaining a civilian nuclear energy of some kind. Special Envoy Witkoff, who's the lead negotiator in talks, Secretary of State Rubio have both clarified what they meant. There is that Iran would be able to import low enriched uranium, not continue to enrich uranium themselves, which is a big difference. Now, moving to the regime side and their positions, I would characterize, again, going with the key stakeholders here in Ali Khamenei, I would characterize their positions as managing expectations. So one quote I think is very revealing from Khamenei in early April. He said, negotiations may or may not lead to a result. We are neither overly optimistic nor pessimistic. So he's not saying very much, except that, again, managing expectations, doesn't want to set the bar too high. I know you had Saeed on your podcast who explained some of the dynamics between the hardliners and others in the regime. So there's a lot for him to deal with there. Another point from Khamenei that I would add is he gave a speech at the end of April or late April. He invokes religious, historical references, uses very cryptic language, but essentially his message was any deal that we make will be temporary. We have an ultimate foreign policy goal. So they're not looking for a long-term deal, and that goes to the regime's broader goal here, which is stall as long as we can. That's their main tactic in these negotiations. We saw that with President Biden in 2022. It worked better for them there because they were getting appeasement, not maximum pressure. I know some, like Saeed on FDD, have said maximum pressure isn't quite working yet. There's an argument I've heard from some that we just need to give it some time. It's getting there, but the regime's goal ultimately is stalling for a short interim deal or a weak deal that allows them to continue to enrich.
All right. Well, we're going to hope that the negotiator in chief doesn't buy that, and of course, you get the Israelis looking for something that's longer, stronger, more durable. But all right, so let's fast forward to this past weekend, round 4. Any progress? Anything that we can point to as, positive news?
The Wall Street Journal described it as progress is now being defined as becoming better with understanding where the differences are and where they have fallen apart. So that's kind of where we're at now. Again, round 4 was supposed to take place last week. It got postponed because of some tensions going on. There was some Houthi action. Secretary of Defense Hegseth's tweet saying we will hold Iran accountable for any Houthi actions. But so we reached the 4th round. One key difference here, which makes it sound like there wasn't necessarily progress, is in the 3rd round 2 weeks ago on April 26th, there was 2 parallel conversations going on. There was Witkoff and Araqchi, and then there was a technical conversation led by Michael Anton on the U.S. side. That was not there in round 4. There was just the conversation with Witkoff and Araqchi. Now, that suggests that it's almost a step backwards, yet the comments coming out of the meetings still said, Araqchi said, we're getting closer on some issues, we're getting deeper, talks were more serious and candid, is what he said. So it's hard to square that with no technical talks. Now, one important point I would say also, going into this, Steve Witkoff, there was a lot of conversation about what is he demanding, what is he asking, is it different than others in the administration or President Trump? He clarified very clearly on Friday, 2 days before these talks, complete dismantlement. They cannot have centrifuges. They have to downblend all of their fuel, send it to a faraway place. He said an enrichment program can never exist in the state of Iran. That's our red line. And then separately, he tweeted on X, he posted on X saying, as I've always said, there will never be a deal where obligations are allowed to sunset. That's an important point on the sunsets, because coming out of this meeting, again, out of round 4, Araqchi or Pezeshkian, I'm sorry, I can't remember at the time, but one of them said, enrichment must definitely continue, but there is no room for compromise in it. But however, dimensions, levels, or amounts might change for a period of time for confidence building.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like they're really not on the same page. I mean, if we talk about dismantlement, and we're talking about no enrichment, and the Iranians, the regime continues to talk about enrichment at certain levels and temporary. So, you ask me, the technical components of this seem like a complete waste of time, because there actually should be no technical components to this, right? If you're not enriching uranium, then there's nothing technical to talk about other than perhaps destroying the nuclear facilities and making that a permanent change as it relates to the Iranian regime. So I got to say, I'm still confused about what's going on. To me, it seems like we're kind of spinning our wheels. But all right, I want to pivot now to Congress, because I do think that, generally speaking, Congress, it's a lot of hot air a lot of the time. It's letters, it's declarations. But in this particular case, it does feel like Congress has a crucial role to play, because Congress, specifically congressional Republicans, probably Senate congressional Republicans, are the ones who are able to hold the Trump administration accountable as it relates to a possible nuclear deal. What they're basically saying is, you want to pursue your other legislative agenda, all the other things that you want to accomplish in these 4 years, then you've got to do right by us as it relates to Iran. That seems to be the message right now. So they're holding the regime's feet, or the administration's feet, to the fire, and holding the regime's feet to the fire as it relates to complete disarmament, complete dismantlement. So what are you hearing out of Congress right now?
First, just to go back to your follow-up before, I think it's, as you explained, it's hard to tell a little bit who's playing who here. Both sides seem to be tapping each other along, because if the demands that each side were making publicly were made privately, you would think talks would have broken down at this round. Now, going to Congress, I think you explained it perfectly. Senate Republicans are going to be the key here. I think early on in this process, what we heard from especially Senate Republicans was, we don't want to get ahead of the president on this. He ran on trying to get a deal with the Islamic Republic. We have to give him the chance to do that. Now, in terms of the technicalities of a deal and the process of a deal, we're starting to get more from the more, let's say, hawkish senators, people like Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Lindsey Graham. Senator Cotton, of course, famously in 2015 wrote a letter to Khamenei directly, translated into Persian, saying, this wasn't, if this deal is not going to be passed through Congress, it's not going to be an official treaty. It will be withdrawn from the next president. I was pleased to see Senator Cotton and Graham come out and say that again, mention INARA, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which is what states that any agreement with Iran needs to go through Congress. It needs to get 67 votes. And Lindsey Graham very clearly said there is no way to get 67 votes to ratify a treaty without Iran totally dismantling its nuclear and ballistic missiles program. So ballistic missiles is a topic that hasn't come up much in these conversations, but it has been addressed in Congress. And I would add, there was a little bit of a mix-up with Senator Cotton. He had one quote where he said something about Iran can't have highly enriched uranium, and some took that to mean he was saying, though, they could have low enriched uranium. He very clearly came out within a few hours and clarified, and I don't think there's any concern where these GOP senators stand on full dismantlement.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think they're playing an important role here, and I do believe that Donald Trump is kind of hanging on every word, right, that they're uttering or that they're releasing right now. He knows that he's being watched. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have lots of flexibility for him and Stephen Witkoff and others, but I think at the same time, he does understand that there are parameters that are going to fly and parameters that won't. And so I think that's actually a very good thing. So, okay, I want to get to one other player that we haven't heard much about, and that is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is the international nuclear watchdog, this multilateral organization. Since this latest round of talks began, I haven't heard much from them. So what are they saying, and what kind of role do you think they're going to play?
It's likely that they will have an integral role if there is a deal once technical talks get going. The regime, as part of their stalling tactic, has made comments like, we're not ready for the serious talks with the IAEA. We're not at that stage. I mean, in their timeline, they'll get to that stage in 20 years. So that's not real. But the important point from the IAEA that I think has gone under the radar is something Rafael Grossi, the chief of the agency, has said multiple times since 2022, which is the agency has lost continuity of knowledge regarding Iran's nuclear program. So what happened here is when talks broke down with President Biden and the regime in 2022, Iran turned off some of its surveillance and surveillance cameras monitoring equipment at nuclear facilities. They've been turned back on, they've been turned back off. The problem, as Grossi has expressed repeatedly over the last few years, is that it's not just that they turned cameras back on and all is good. It's hard for the agency to figure out what happened in the time that the cameras were turned off. And if we don't know where the program is at today, it makes the talks about what to do with the program much more difficult. So the IAEA actually will, based on the framework that we're presented, whether you think they're useful or not, as an agency, will have a key role here and will need to be more involved and get more information for any potential deal to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you think they would be important. My question, though, is if they're essentially irrelevant now, how do they become more relevant? And then I guess the other question that I have, and I don't know if we know how to answer this, but if the technical elements of this are not relevant right now, right? In other words, if you're not, enriching to 3.67%, and there's, none of these technical things are actually, are being called for by a future agreement, and what role do they have to play other than the simple overseeing of the dismantlement of the entire infrastructure? That's where I think they have a role to play, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see on that. I do want to ask you before we let you go. I know NUFDI talks a lot about this. FDD talks a lot about this. We talk about maximum support for the Iranian people, the population of Iran, right? They don't see themselves as being, citizens of the Islamic Republic. They see themselves as Persians. They see themselves as Iranians. They don't want to be living under the control of this odious regime. So what is going on right now among the Iranian people as they're watching this play out? How are they viewing the discussions? How are they viewing the war? And I guess more importantly, what can we do to help them?
Sure. Great question, Jonathan. Thank you. I would echo a little bit of what Saeed said on an episode a bit ago, which was heading into this with Trump administration before the talk started, there was more of a feeling that an uprising could occur as civil unrest was getting higher. That has gone down a little bit for sure. One of the more striking images coming out of Iran at the moment was someone writing on a wall inside of Iran in both Persian and English, "Don't sell us out, President Trump." Meaning they view a deal with the regime as saving the regime at its weakest point in history. So that leads us into maximum support. And one thing I would disagree with that Saeed kind of mentioned in passing at the very end, but he had said that if the deal occurs and is successful, there will not likely be maximum support, which is the policy, of course, that NUFDI and FDD and Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi have advocated for a long time now. I would push back on that and say, actually, regardless of what happens with the deal, but especially if there is a successful deal, the importance of maximum support only grows. And the logic there is right now, U.S.-Iran policy is focused on the nuclear file only. President Trump has made that very clear when asked about Iran. He specifically only talks about nuclear weapons. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. Once that's taken care of, if the nuclear file is off the plate, everything else comes back to the forefront. They still have ballistic missiles they can immediately threaten Israel and our allies with. They still have proxy groups. They're still funding terrorism. They're still conducting brutal repression and human rights abuses at home in Iran. So all of these things stay relevant. And now U.S.-Iran policy, the core of it will be some elements of maximum pressure that aren't lifted from any deal, and then maximum support for the Iranian people. So things like there's a bill Beth Mohammed mentioned in your last episode, the Maximum Support Act. It covers a lot of this, just socializing the ideas of what maximum support looked like, how the U.S. government can develop a maximum support strategy for the Iranian people, establishing a special envoy for maximum support. And one critical element, while we have time, that I'll mention is it asks the U.S. government to develop a strategy for encouraging defections from the regime, for creating a pathway for defections, whether it's security forces, scientists, engineers, to start to get into the fracture, because the regime is so weak at the moment. Morale is so low. There is dysfunction. And when we talk about, NUFDI just had a conference called the Iran Prosperity Project, where we went into a little bit of planning for what could happen if the regime does fall. How do you transition to a free, democratic Iran? And one thing that's essential to all any peaceful, civil transition in this kind of situation is defections from the security forces. So that was an important point put in there. And there's also, of course, internet activities. VPNs have been talked about for a long time. We went into direct-to-cell Starlink satellite internet, things that don't need devices smuggled into Iran. So there's a lot that can be done regardless of what happens with this deal. It can be done now. It can be done after. We will, as Behnam said, continue to advocate for it regardless of what happens.
As will we here at FDD. We're going to leave it there. Thank you, Andrew Ghalili, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks, Jonathan.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Don't miss the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy with host Cliff May and guest Melanie Phillips, a British journalist and author known for her unflinching critiques of the UK's capitulation to Islamist extremism and her defense of Judeo-Christian values as the foundation of Western civilization. Together, Cliff and Melanie dissect Israel's war against Hamas and the global surge in anti-Semitism. My colleague Ivana Stratner has a new piece in The Telegraph exposing how Putin invokes the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany to justify his war in Ukraine, absurdly casting it as a continuation of Russia's anti-Nazi struggle. As a counter to this propaganda, Ivana suggests an unexpected response: humor. Stratner urges the US, UK, and other Western nations to weaponize satire, reviving Soviet-era jokes about Stalin to mock Putin and to underscore the ludicrous nature of his narrative. And finally, my colleague Andrea Stricker has a new policy brief on FDD's website amidst this latest round of nuclear talks. In that policy brief, she makes one thing crystal clear: even a trace of uranium enrichment puts Iran on the path to weaponization. Her message to the administration: hold the line. That means full dismantlement, zero enrichment. Any slippage, no matter how small, could prove disastrous and render these multi-round negotiations meaningless. And that is your Monday episode, folks. If you're craving more brainy things to read, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, or take a scroll through our X, Instagram, and YouTube content. And please do support our work with a generous tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another gripping, riveting, exciting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, We'll keep on tracking those headlines so you don't have to. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.